Season 9, Episode 14 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We're, of course, reading Orestes Brownson's The American Republic, Its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny. This time, going through the second to last chapter, so almost done with this book. But this chapter is all about what Brownson thinks is the sort of future of America and what he thinks sort of the two different camps, the two different schools of thoughts that have sort of battled it out during the Civil War, and how they might sort of shape the American future, and which ones, he doesn't really agree with either school of thought. He says, both are kind of wrong in different ways. But sort of looking at, what do American people generally think about their country and what are they going to do and try and shape it according to that thought.
Yeah, and do I sound like I'm in a tin can? Because I feel like I sound like I'm in a tin can.
Maybe a little bit. That's all right.
Okay, good. So there'll be an echo for our listener. Anywho, I feel like it's reverberating in this room. Anyway, I should put some carpets or blankets down or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so he starts off and it seems like his view of the United States at that time is similar to my view and probably your view too about that the most marked. I mean, it just starts the chapter. I mean, I keep quoting his initial sentence each chapter, but he does a good job of set table, so to speak. He says the most marked political tendency of the American people has been since 1825 to interpret government as a pure and simple democracy and to shift it from a territorial to a purely popular basis, or from the people as the state inseparably united, blah, 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 blah. He says their tendency has unconsciously, therefore, been to change their constitution from a republican to a despotic, or from a civilized to a barbaric constitution, which is what he's kind of always been railing against in this book. And he concedes that the American Constitution is democratic. But again, he's kind of restating this is a territorial democracy, or really a territorial republic, but that it's tied with the people within a certain geography, and it's not just something that you carry about with your personal sovereignty type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, he starts off, it's pretty strong language throughout, and these are sort of topics that I think, again, it's like the modern day, they seem like very reasonable assertions here. Well, yeah, of course it's a democracy. Of course it's just, voice of the people is sort of the voice of God in America. I think that is how a lot of people look at the country.
The vast majority of people, I think the vast majority of people would agree with those statements.
And then to see this where he's like, yeah, no, that's actually despotic and that's actually barbaric, to sort of understand the country in this way. It's almost off-putting to see him describing those words. I don't, of course, think of, America as a pure, simple democracy. But for him to say that as being despotic is kind of wild.
Yeah. And what I really like about it is on the next page, 170, it says, this is the so-called Jeffersonian democracy in which the government has no powers, such as it derives from the consent of the governed, and its personal democracy or pure individualism, philosophically considered pure egoism, which says, I am God. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like when you have a pure democracy, the more purely democratic you get, the more people will substitute their personal privileges. They'll assert those as if they are God. The more you get, the closer you get to that, the less there's control over it, meaning that there's no brakes on it. We've talked many times in different episodes with various seasons how dangerous true democracy is for that reason. Like they just make life and death decisions. I shouldn't say we'd probably do the same thing. If we're probably do the same thing. Maybe because we were like Socrates, only we, because we know our limitations, would be wise enough not to go down that path. But perhaps not, depending on the issue.
Yeah.
So I really like his point of view on that one.
Yeah, because that's what he says. You back to that the page before.
You always go back. You always have to go back. No, but I'm trying to get us to progress through this book, and every time you always go back. I went one page. Go ahead.
I like his quote here, where he says, "In every man, there's a natural craving for personal freedom and unrestrained action, a strong desire to be himself, not another, to be his own master, to go when and where he pleases, to do what he chooses, to take what he wants, whatever, wherever he can find it, and to keep what he takes." And he says that's sort of the principle that a lot of the American people are sort of embodying, and that's what he means. That's what he's drawing from when it says, "I am God." Right? And I think that's what a lot of people view the government as, is like, well, let me do whatever I want. And the government needs to support me in letting me do whatever I want and helping me along that path. It's a very self-centered point of view, I think, a lot of time.
That's an interesting way to look at that, because I viewed a lot of modernity as not being that assertive with their progress, almost more passive. But that is, like as far as their personal life and what they're going to do and they're going to take. I mean, I think anyway, that's just the way I saw it. But you're right. I mean, that mentality, that that the people are asserting, hey, whatever decisions I make, is the law. Whatever my prerogatives are. I think I just agree with that before you said it. So I would still agree with that.
Yeah. I'm glad you still agree with what you said 2 minutes ago. You haven't changed your mind since then.
Your statement has not convinced me I'm wrong.
Well, good, because I was agreeing with you. I'm very confused if it did make you change your mind.
Well, have you ever been in a situation where you're talking about a subject and somebody agrees with you and you're like, and they explain it, kind of flesh it out a little bit more, and you're like, God, that's really stupid. And you realize you were wrong to believe that. I've done that a lot of times. And it's really because I'm so critical of other people. It's when they restate my opinions back to me, I'm like, God, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
Wait, I just said that. I'm an idiot. Well, that's why you need to talk to people about your ideas, and I think that's I'm going to get a little topical.
Sure.
I think that's why we are a lot of the reason why we're in the situation we are today in American society is we aren't having those kind of conversations where we can kind of hear a somewhat different version of what we believe, and certainly we're not seeking out contradictory stuff. Of course, a lot of that is, I mean, speaking from personal experience, I almost never go on Facebook anymore. And I've literally defriended, I mean, not like I did it in a fit of anger, but I've defriended anybody who is partisan and from my friends list because, I started thinking poorly of them personally because of the stuff they were saying. And so I'm not hearing the alternate view of people I know that disagree with me, and so I'm kind of guilty of that myself. But I have my own selfish reasons to do that. Just because the tone that was being said to me was like it's counterproductive, and we get inundated with that point of view from the mainstream media or the. It's true. They're not really mainstream anymore. I mean, when you look at the downloads, I mean, Trump famously just went on Joe Rogan. I don't know how many views or people have listened to that podcast yet, but I'm sure it's over 20 million. And we're recording this on Sunday, and that was recorded, Friday afternoon. And you look at the ratings for like an interview on CNN, they're like orgasmic if it's like 6 million people. It's a nationwide TV network, and this is just some guy with like us, but he has a camera on. He's a little bit more effective and interesting, but we'll get there.
One day Trump will be our guest.
Why not? When Joe Rogan started out, it was just him and some dudes in his living room. Yeah. It's like what we're doing, except for now we're more sophisticated than he was. Of course, that was at the advent of the internet. Yeah. And he famously got started with that one. Who was that one guy who's kind of a comedian? He was on MTV, and he started like really what was the first podcast? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know anything about his
start. He briefly dated Drew Barrymore, if I remember correctly. Tom somebody.
I have no idea. I could not tell you. You think I follow MTV figures from the early 2000s? I don't think that's really in my sphere.
This would be the 90s.
Yeah,
Tom Green. And I never thought he was funny, but he had like some sort of, and it wasn't like a podcast, it was an internet thing. Like you'd have web pages, right? This is before social media. And he had all these wires and stuff. And I think Joe Rogan was a guest of his. And he's like, I can. He looks around. I can do this. How'd you do this? And like, I think I mean, imagined that I've listened to part of that, but the Joe Rogan retells the story periodically that he's like asking Tom Green, how are you doing this? What are all these wires going to? And he's kind of trying, and it dawns on him, I could do this too, and I could talk to my my comedian buddies and my fighting buddies and just put it out there because it's fun,
Yeah.
and that's how it all started. So
Go.
we're like next generation, and nobody was listening to him.
Yeah.
Beginning. It wasn't until he started bringing on all like the alien people and it's tripping acid and all that kind of stuff. Back to our subject. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's all right.
Did you? I'm going to completely take over this thing.
Sure. No, go ahead.
Did you enjoy the Lord of the Rings themed?
I did.
That I sent to you.
Those are good. Those are good.
There's the one about. I don't have my phone here. The one about
I'll pull it up.
The Eagles of Gondor.
Yeah.
Or Eagles going. They were not of Gondor. I know.
Yeah.
That one where it's like in the form of Joe Rogan talking to Trump. I think the Babylon Bee. Didn't they post that? Somebody from the Babylon Bee?
Yeah, it was. It's Kyle Mann, I think the CEO of the Babylon Bee.
They were just so funny.
Why didn't they just like take the Eagles into Mordor?
Yeah, like Joe,
it wouldn't work. Sauron has the Nazgul.
But wait. They couldn't just fly around them? Then Trump says, have you seen the Nazgul, Joe? Huge. They're unbelievable. Too, if an eagle had the one ring, bam, now you have a Dark Lord eagle. Complete total disaster. I mean, that was just so funny. And you could just see those two having that kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's great.
So anyway, I saw that on the Twitter, and I said,
that was very funny.
So where were we at? I completely got aside.
We were talking about sort of the egoistic ideas that are now sort of in this idea of democracy now. That's what he kind of says. The idea that's sort of first and foremost in the people who think of the government as a compact, right? If everything is sort of like the self-centered, if everything is very pure democracy sort of things, then of course there's going to be a lot of overlap between them and the people who think, everything's kind of just an agreement we have with each other because the power is just in the pure individual rather than any sort of territorial idea. It's just we as the people, we are the basis of this power, of this authority. We're kind of making ourselves God in that way.
And he talks about this concept, which I've not heard before. He talks about humanitarian democracy, which scorns all geographical lines, faces in all in individualities, and professes to plant itself on humanity alone. Has acquired by the war new strength, and is not without menace to our future. And he goes into some detail about what he's talking about here, which seems to me it's kind of like he's has a premonition of like the social justice warriors and their virtue signaling.
Yeah,
he's talking about this humanitarian democracy. There's another term he used to describe people that they're basically humanitarian towards men, but not a humanitarian towards a man. They love humanity, but they hate people. So he seems to be kind of articulating that in some ways, but he talks about how the solidarity of a nation is the basis of international law, binding on every particular nation, in which every civilized nation recognizes, forces on its own subjects or citizens through its own courts, an integral part of its own municipal and national law. So he's really, again, trying to tie in this whole territorial and geographic foundation or anchoring of what a country is, and he's kind of rejecting this individual thought, and that as individual citizens you're agreeing to this contract, every day or every year or whatever. That I agree to this, and then you somehow that, well, of course, it implies that you wake up tomorrow and say, nope, I don't want to do that anymore, and I'm out. Yeah, and that's just not true. I mean, you can't just. I mean, I guess you can renounce your citizenship, but you're still subject to the sovereignty of the nation. You'd have to move and become a citizen somewhere else. Yeah, literally.
And that's why he says, because that's when he starts to go into, the first of the sort of two opposing views that he describes is based on this. He says that's what you see in the southern states now, kind of emerging, is this sort of individualism in that, all of our rights are just held very personally. It's not a territorial thing. And that's why he says that's why they have the idea of, well, we don't have to give rights to black people. We don't have to give those rights to them, right? Because it is such a personal thing, and because I have the rights now, there's no reason for me to give them to that group of people. We can just decide it based on these groups of people, on this whole social compact type of idea. He says, the tendency of the Southern Democrat was to deny the unity of the race as well as all obligations of society to protect the weak and helpless, and therefore all true civil society. So he says, on
Yeah.
one hand, like this complete rampant individualism means that you just really won't have a state at all. You won't have a society, right? Because everybody's very self-interested. You don't have to care for the weak. It's all about, I have the power to make the decisions, and I can just use that power however I want. And it's very intertwined with that idea of the compact.
Yeah. And even though he's talking about that, but he it's funny because he's so, and it's pretty common at the time. He's so against the abolitionists.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like, maybe I'm just reading too much into it. He seems to really dislike them
Yeah.
more than he really dislikes the segregationists.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me.
Yeah, because
Uh,
he moves on from the segregationists, and that's the other opposing philosophy here is that of the North, which essentially says he says it's a tendency to exaggerate the social element, to overlook the territorial basis of the state, and to disregard the rights of individuals,
mm,
right? And so if you go the opposite direction, then you don't have any idea of territory at all. Everybody's just sort of like a kumbaya kind of globalism type thing, when it's
mm,
just like still very much like in that idea of democracy and very egoistical, but it's taking the different direction where it's
yeah,
like we as humans are all kind of the same. And democracy, because it's held by the people, we can just spread it to wherever, and everybody just kind of has to listen to the majority. And
yeah.
so, on one hand, the South is so focused on the individual, they don't care for society. And on the other hand, the North is so focused on sort of society, in air quotes, that they can't focus on the individual at all.
Yeah, and I think he's making some good points there, and I really appreciated his thoughts about how terrible slavery is, because I was starting
Yeah.
to wonder a little
Yeah.
bit about some of the other reading, but then we'll get to it in a second. And then he makes a very good argument that it's he mentions it as barbaric.
hmm
Uh, he says the territorial democracy would not unite to eliminate even so barbaric an element as slavery till the rebellion gave them the constitutional right to abolish it. And even then, so scrupulous were they that they demanded a constitutional amendment so as to be able to make clean work of it without any blow to individual or states' rights. And he says, this is the top of 173. The abolitionists were right in opposing slavery, but not in demanding its abolition on humanitarian or socialistic grounds, which I was a little confused by.
hmm
But I like that he's clearly against slavery, and he again talks about that the people in the South, that they were not stupid, that they read about the classics, and they always reference whether slavery in Greece and Rome and those great societies, but he points out that those societies also imploded, and they weren't really better than the other societies. They were just of
hmm
the same system, and they fell through their own weakness caused by the barbarism within. And he says, it really, slavery wasn't really um, um, improved until Christianity came in on the scene.
hmm
This is the infusion of the Christian dogma of the unity and solidarity of the race into the belief, the life, the laws, and jurisprudence of civilized nations is doomed slavery and every species of barbarism. But this our slaveholding countrymen saw not, which I thought was
hmm
a very strong
Yeah.
statement, and a very welcome statement to read, because I was
Yeah.
starting to wonder. But he is also saying that the those opposing parties philosophically or almost procedurally created the Civil War, and he treats slavery as kind of like almost like a symptom as opposed to the cause.
Mm.
Like this is it could have been the issue could have been, railroad gauges. He doesn't see it as a fundamental issue. He just sees it as one group is trying to impose its will on the other, and they couldn't come to an agreement. And because he does mention, he does minimize it. I'm trying to remember what
Yeah.
page I have.
Well, he
Right.
says, it might be on the bottom of page 173, where he says slavery was only incidentally
Yes.
involved in the late war.
Yes.
Um, and so, yeah, I think he is, minimizing it a little bit. But I don't think he's minimizing it so much that he's like, yeah, it's not a problem, right? Because he is still saying, it is barbaric, and
True.
early
Yeah.
on page 173, he says, is in direct antagonism to American civilization. The whole force of the national life opposes it and must finally eliminate it or become itself extinct. So even
Yeah.
he recognized, like, if we keep slavery going, America's going to collapse. Like, there's no way we can have this system. I think what he's really saying here, and it being like an incidental thing, is really like it is sort of the product of this whole worldview, right? And I think it's similar. Like I think we could kind of draw a comparison between that and like abortion, right? Where we see abortion as a very, very horrible issue, and maybe America won't exist if we continue to allow abortion. But if we were to fight, a civil war right now, it wouldn't necessarily be over abortion. It'd be over two competing worldviews, and how different groups of people even see life and how life works within, the civic framework and stuff like that. So he's like, there's something bigger at play rather than this just specific issue.
Yeah.
It's a big worldview competition here, a battle of these two opposing philosophies.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point because if there were going to be a civil war on abortion, it's going to be two competing issues of values.
Hmm.
If the pro-life camp decides to essentially equate it to a human rights issue like and a civil rights issue like slavery, then we can't sit idly by while California aborts children
Hmm.
if they're in our nation,
Yeah.
because it's abhorrent, it's unconstitutional. You're killing citizens, you know,
Hmm.
that just haven't been born yet, and the other side considers it a constitutional right of freedom and governmental encroachment on personal decisions, and they would be asserting the states' rights argument at that point,
Yeah.
because you'd have different states have different rules, which is what Trump is arguing now,
Hmm.
that you could have 50 different rules, and I think it may have some wisdom in that because perhaps we can come to some agreement eventually, but I fear that we'll end up with a division of the states like the Civil War
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And then you'll be like, well, if you want a country that allows your children to kill your grandchildren by abortion, then all you abhorrent weirdos and child killers should go that to the jurisdiction and leave the fair state of Missouri
Hmm.
unpolluted by your evil satanic views.
Yeah.
To say it nicely.
Yeah. To say it politely.
Um,
But yeah, I
and
mean, I think it's,
vice versa, and then we'll
yeah.
have a sorting, and then you could see that as well. It's not really about abortion, but it is.
Hmm.
It's really about these two different constitutional views of the effective role of government in regulating these types of constitutional issues and states' rights and individual
Yeah.
citizens' rights within a separate state. It's the parallels are so obvious. It's a
Yeah.
little spooky,
Yeah.
that we could be heading to something like that.
Yeah. Because it's like
Because
if
they
that,
tried to do this. They tried to do this with slavery.
yeah.
I mean, generally it was a geographical thing too, but there were a lot of people in the North for a long time. They were saying, "Look, it's a state issue. If you think it's a bad deal, you've got to talk to them and convince them
Hmm.
down there to pass a law to abolish slavery. We're not going to do it at the point of a bayonet." And until they had to, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
until well, really, and they probably wouldn't have actually if the South hadn't seceded. I mean, I guess there's their fear was, hey, this is coming down the pike, and we've
Hmm.
got to assert ourselves. They've got this anti-slavery guy that's been elected by the northern states exclusively, and it's a danger to us. But I think if they wouldn't have jumped the gun, um, it might not have happened.
Yeah. Maybe not.
At least it wouldn't happen right away. Anyway, sorry to
Yeah.
go on
No, no,
tangent.
no, that's good. But yeah, no, he keeps moving on, after he talks about how slavery is only incidentally involved. He said it is that collision of two extreme parties.
Yeah,
It's the difference between the territorial democracy and the personal democracy, and in reality, on the part of the nation, as much a war against the socialism of the abolitionist as against the individualism of the slaveholder.
Yeah.
Yet the victory, though complete over the former, is only half won over the latter, for it has left the humanitarian democracy standing, and perhaps for the moment stronger than ever. And so he
Yeah.
says now the North is really sort of emboldened. These people who are sort of the more what he terms socialist, which I think now has very different connotations, but what he's saying is really looking at the social in complete favor of the individual and sort of looking at things without any reference to territory, but in an opposite way, as the individualists down south, is much more of that idea of sort of pushing power more towards, the federal government. He kind of talks about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
And kind of going back to Reconstruction, like he did in last chapter, where it's like suddenly we have the president, we have Congress, the National Congress, sort of saying, yeah, actually, we are going to sort of decide things for the southern states now, instead of sort of just welcoming them back into the union and making them do things themselves, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing that appeal to, well, no, actually, we know better. We know what's better for society writ large, and we shouldn't care so much about the territorial boundaries here because we know better than you, and here's how you are going to do it by our command.
Yeah. And he talks about that or the similar that type of concept of we know better and we're better people and forcing it down your throat as the bigger danger.
Yeah.
So 175 it says the humanitarians are more dangerous in principle than the egoists, for they have the appearance of building on a broader and deeper foundation of being more Christian, more philosophic, more generous and philanthropic. But Satan is never more successful than under the guise of an angel of light. His favorite guise in modern times is that of philanthropy. Boy, that's still true,
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean, that's spooky good
Yeah.
stuff right there. You really hit the nail on the head of
Yeah.
people that are that and you see there's not to be super political repeatedly, but these philanthropic efforts now are so overtly political too,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just so destructive.
Yeah.
It's not just, hey, we want good art, we just want to help people out. It's they want to force a certain
Mm.
so-called humanitarian
Yeah.
view on everybody else, and they
Well,
have so much money.
yeah. You see that a lot, like even in the language that they use for things. I think that's been something that's been talked a lot about, of how effective like the use of language is there to convince someone that something is just like inherently good. Like you look at the term social justice, like, yeah, that sounds great. I would love, for society to be just, right? But it's like using these terms and sort of couching these ideas in these sort of nice things where it's like, if you disagree with this, by definition, you're disagreeing with justice, right? And it's such an appeal to like, well, we're just the correct ones here, right? By definition, we're correct because we've defined these terms to show that we are the correct ones. And you see that with like these terms that almost like appeal to virtues, right? We are the real bringers of morality here. You have to agree with these left wing ideologies because we've cased them in these very nice sounding terms.
Yes. Yeah, and then if you don't believe in them or you say anything different, you're a heretic.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You're a heretic. And then he starts talking about, well, what basically he's making the slippery slope argument on the end of 175, 176, where he again goes into that. Well, yeah, you might want to free them. That's great, but you really want to vote? And then if you let them vote, oh God, you're gonna have women voting. Nobody wants women voting, and that seems to be what he's saying there.
Yeah.
I can just see like Norm Macdonald picking up that whole line of humor there, where he's saying if there's a limit to these types of things, and again kind of going back to where I had concerns about him earlier, because he makes really good arguments about that these are your brothers and sometimes literally your kids. I think he said literally your sons or daughters in the context of slaves, because there's so much of that going on, sex with the slaves and that kind of stuff went on in the entire time that there was slavery in the United States. And so he's humanizing, but then he has this huge hesitation of actually giving them equal rights, because he's like, well, they're just going to vote with the property owners, and maybe eventually when they smarten up or something, I don't know. So he, in a way, I guess it's kind of enlightened for some of the people in his time, because he sees a future for that. But he's arguing they're not ready. But I don't know if he sees that. The man who's the head of the household, like God has declared that a woman, the wife should be voting,
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
which I
he
think
is
amuses me to
correct.
no end.
Yeah.
By the way, well, I shouldn't say this. By the, I'm going to say it.
All
Uh,
right.
no, I should. No, I'm not going to say it. It's really a funny thing, but it's a household thing, so I don't want to. I want
All
to say
right.
it. It's a
Maybe after we stop recording then.
yes, yeah. It's a
All right.
running joke that has become really, really funny.
I'm sure
Uh,
you find it funny. I'm not sure there's someone else in the household who might not find it as funny. I don't know what it is, but
Well, I have a theory about that. So I think that if you have a net positive amount of humor, it is worth it. So it depends on how funny it is to one or some of you, and how offensive it is to one or some of you to determine whether it really was a net funny joke.
oh, there you go.
That's
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 good.
my theory of offensive humor.
Oh, that's funny.
You have to somehow estimate. Okay, like if you say a really bad joke, it can't. If you go over that line, it's kind of insulting.
Hmm.
I think it's funny, but that person's really hurt. Well, that's not funny. But if you say something and they're like ha ha, but it's really funny to you, no, maybe it's okay. Maybe it's worth it.
Maybe.
It's good.
Oh, that's funny. But
Anyway, go
he
ahead.
does get one thing right here. I don't think that giving women the right to vote is like the death of our nation or anything like that.
That's
But
correct.
he does say, I think he has like a premonition of the future here. He says, having obliterated all distinction of sex in politics and social, industrial, and domestic arrangement, he must go farther and agitate for equality of property. And he
Yes.
essentially says, like, there's a lot of people now, back in 1865 and even more true today, that are driven by a desire to make everything flat and equal.
Yeah.
Right. And he's like, some people are just naturally better than others at something. Some people are going to be faster. Some people are going to be stronger. Some people are going to be uglier, while some people are prettier. Right.
Yeah.
But sort of the modern
Saying all that.
drive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
saying all that. Yes.
Yeah. The modern drive of these people is just to eliminate any distinction between anything and just make everything sort of flat and equal no matter what. And this is like, 250 years ago or 150 years ago. And he's spot on for where this ideology has gone.
Yes. Well, he would have already seen like the French Revolution and
That's
how the
true. That's true.
so he's not completely in the dark on all that. But it's been taken to absurd levels,
Yeah.
especially with sexuality and the gender thing and the race thing now, to try to equalize outcomes and the disparate impact, a pretty sophisticated litigation about disparate impact policies from the government, where it's like, well, you didn't actually try to do anything bad and you're not racist, but it affected these other people,
Mm.
it affected these people. And that's a really, really terrible line to go down, because you'll see these big payouts to like, well, this test for firefighters to become captains failed this particular racial group at like double the rate. Well, that's a disparate impact, but maybe there's two times as many stupid people of that race taking the test.
Yeah.
Uh, but how do you normalize that?
Hmm.
Then well, it doesn't matter if because your test should be designed to allow for an equal number of people to pass. Well, no, is that the standard? So that's anyway.
Hmm.
But so yeah, you're right. He does as he segues from you know that kind of racial viewpoint into the sex viewpoint. Then he goes into like, hey, where does this stop? This is never going to stop, and he's right about that.
Yeah.
If you try to equalize too many categories, you'll end up with tyranny.
Hmm.
It's because who is it? Thomas Sowell. If you haven't read any Thomas Sowell, you really need to read some of his stuff. He's really good at describing these, where he says, in order to get equality, you have to use increasing amounts of force
Hmm.
and government intervention in order to equalize it further. And I think Jordan Peterson
Yeah.
says similar things, and that's true because as you get closer and closer to equal, you really have to push on the system to get it even more equal because we're all individuals,
Hmm.
and that's really where the tyranny comes in. The
Yeah.
danger comes in for everybody. You're like, no, we don't want to do that. All right, so where were we at?
Yeah. Page
Um,
176, 177, still talking, and he's essentially
Jeez,
saying, what'd you say?
I'm 2 pages ahead of you. Where are you
Oh,
at?
are you? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I thought we were still talking about that.
Go
But he's
ahead.
essentially saying, like, how all of these other, even more left-wing, governments at the time, I think he refers to like the Jacobins, followers of that philosophy are like, yeah, this is fantastic that the North won here, not because it was a victory over slavery, but because
Yeah.
it was a victory for this ideology that's happening. He says we should be cautious about, who's praising the victory here. It's not just a 100% moral victory here. We have to be cautious about what we're doing going forward, because otherwise we're going to end up in a really, really bad situation.
And that's a good life lesson for all groups or individuals. If you look around at your group of close friends and you think these people are all horrible, you might be a bad person. And the same is true as like, well, I'm on the side of all these really bad people. I don't know. Maybe I should relook at, if
Mhm.
if your political group is beating up old ladies, no, I'm not saying anybody's doing that now, but it's like, well, maybe I'm in the wrong side of
Yeah.
this. Anyway, yeah, and if anybody I call them Jacobins. You say Jacobins,
Yeah, maybe.
tomato, tomato.
Jacobins, Jacobin. I think
Yeah,
Jacobin.
I think Jacobin sounds more harsh and more
It
evil.
does.
And
It
then
does. Yeah,
I
that's
I
true.
use Jacobins. It also kind of sounds like it's going to start being profane, but it doesn't
Mm,
get,
yeah,
Jacobins.
yeah.
It's like a Jack o' lantern. I don't know, or Jack Rabbit, or some other Jack.
Yes, no, I caught on to what you were implying much earlier.
Oh,
Um,
okay. I
but
don't know.
but he continues on, like on page 181, he's essentially saying he talks for a little bit about how predominant this sort of socialistic and centralizing tendency is, and it's going to keep gaining force. He says, but there's kind of a little bit of a spot of hope in that it won't really gain a foothold in the South, right?
Mm,
But he says, it's sort of a blessing and a curse because, the South's philosophy is also bad. This very purely individualistic idea without much concern for societal well-being.
mm.
So it's like, how do we balance these things? And he's not really sure, I don't think. I don't know if he really proposes a solid solution throughout this chapter. It's like, we have these two competing ideologies, and they're both going to end up with terrible results for the country. And it seems like, his only spot of hope is just sort of balancing them between each other. So neither can really gain a foothold, but that's not really a lasting solution for this.
I saw the ray of hope according to him as the Catholics.
Well, that's true. Yeah, he does
I
talk about
really,
that a little later.
I really
That's
did
true.
appreciate that. He says, like the Catholics are numerous and an important part of the population. And he says, the best things written on the controversy, we're talking about these issues we're talking about now, have been written by Catholics, and Catholics are better fitted by their religion to comprehend the real character of the American Constitution than any other class of Americans the moment that they study it in the light of their own theology. And I think he's really talking about, I'm assuming he's talking about like natural law, and there's
Hmm.
certain rules,
Yeah.
and you're born with these rights rather than the government's giving them to you. At least that's the way I read it. And what did I say?
Yeah.
I
Well, because he
another
is essentially just like describing Catholic social teaching on this, right? Because
yes,
it's
right.
essentially what the Catholics teach is like, we should have, safeguards, for people who are, in danger and need help. But we should also recognize that everybody's an individual and has free will and things like that. And so it is absolutely a balance of these things. But yeah, no, I really appreciate because he talks for a long time about, how great the Catholics are here. And of course, he was a convert to Catholicism. But
Yes.
it's a similar point that Tocqueville makes in Democracy in America.
Hmm.
He kind of mentions it as an aside, but he says essentially along the lines of like, if American conservatism has any hope, it has to be either, it will be either purely atheistic or purely Catholic.
Mm,
Because if you want to have a strong sort of movement here, you have to agree like on a cohesive worldview, right?
mm.
And he predicted like there will be a growing number of Catholics in America who are pushing for conservatism and have sort of the best answers here because they can put everything into a cohesive worldview and line it up with the rest of history. He says the same really can't be said for as many Protestants, and it wouldn't work as well with an atheistic worldview. So it's a very similar thoughts there, I think.
Um, yeah, and I'm in kind of a more hopeful mood than I have been
Well, that's
before.
good.
Some days I'm hopeful, some days I'm morose.
Hmm.
But I've been thinking a lot about the Catholic. If the Catholic administration bureaucracy could get their act together, I think there's a real opportunity there. If that could be separated from the corruption and the silliness and the left wing BS that they put out. I think they could really turn the corner and really be a huge force in the world, because I really do feel like, well, so the Catholic Church theology is relatively unchanged, for the
Hmm.
last 2,000 years, really. But like the social teaching and the stupid little issues here and there have of course gone to the left. But they've maintained some controversial, consistent thoughts about men being the priests.
Hmm.
Because there's like almost a revolt when the Pope started making noises about women ordaining women priests, and I think he probably would have if the entire clergy didn't rise up against it. And they didn't have pitchforks yet, but and I understand the argument against it, and I'm sympathetic to it. But my point is, in this long-winded little thing aside here, is that I think because there's so few people that believe anything, if you have one religion that just sticks to its guns
Yeah.
on major issues, I think you can really make a difference at that point. There's such an opportunity
Hmm.
for the Catholic Church now, if they do it the right way, with the right leadership and the right
Yeah.
emphasis. Just say, you know what, this is what we believe, and this is why. And if you agree with that, come join us. If
Yeah.
you don't,
Well,
we'll
that's
here and we'll
yeah.
we'll welcome you in when you figure it out.
Yeah. That's something that I've actually noticed, like at these political conferences and clubs that I go to and stuff like that. There's a disproportionate amount of Catholics, and not
Hmm.
just like Catholics, like, oh, I was raised Catholic and did this, but like ardent Catholics who like read the church fathers for fun. And these are the types of people, like the young people that are like getting into politics and stuff like that. And I've
Yeah,
seen that like with the Catholic community here in Gainesville. Like we have a huge growing like RCIA community of like young adults and college students and stuff like that. Because I think for that exact reason, like there's a lot of people out there where it's like modern society's like, yeah, there isn't really any truth about anything. Everything's kind of relative, and people are sick of that. And
yes,
one of the best places that I think people have found to turn to is the Catholic Church, where it has, stayed largely the same for 2,000 years and is pointing to a truth that stays the same and doesn't change and isn't just relative to what people think.
right.
And so I think that's huge. I think Catholics are becoming an increasing political force, especially on the right. I mean, you see that with J.D. Vance, right? I mean, technically, we just had a Catholic president, Joe Biden, who I don't think really believes in anything the Catholic Church teaches, but like J.D. Vance, who's a convert to Catholicism and like actually believes in what the church teaches and seems to be vocal about it. And so I think it is a growing group for sure.
Well, and I think that was a big failure of the Catholic Church to deal with the Joe Bidens and the
Yeah.
Nancy
Yeah,
Pelosi's
I mean, especially like
head
on
on.
abortion. Yeah.
And they should just say, look, we love you. It's otherwise, I'm sure you're fine people. But when you're out there and you are saying abortion on demand is great, and you are signing a bill that funds abortions, you're just not Catholic. You might be
Yeah.
something close, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the door swings both ways, and it's
Yeah.
time for you to go. And I'm hoping, maybe I'm just being irrationally hopeful. I'm hoping that the next pope and the next generation Catholic leaders will say, look, you're doing more damage to our church by saying you're Catholic when you're clearly not,
Hmm.
than any damage that would occur if we just tell everybody, look, you're not Catholic. Okay,
Yeah.
you're something, but you're not Catholic. And there's still a fair number of church-going Catholics that believe they're pro-choice, but they're a distinct minority
Yeah.
because the church has been pretty consistent about it. But I think that the main issue, not to get too much in the abortion issue, the main issue is that there's actually a liturgy and a catechism that's been so consistent through the
Hmm.
ages, and the Protestant churches are really failing on that now.
Yeah.
I mean, like if I go up to that record store, Euclid Records, which is in, was it Webster or Webster
Yeah.
Groves, or
Webster Groves. Yeah.
there's like four churches in this 4 block area, beautiful old churches, and they've got the trans flag out. Each one of them has a different type of rainbow or trans flag, and And that's all well and good. They can do whatever they want, but um, that is not, consistent
Yeah.
with
Well, that's one of the
Christianity or with the Old Testament for sure.
yeah.
I mean, and the Bible is both, you
Mhm.
know. So you're doing something, and I'm sure you can be good people to a degree, but we don't need that wishy-washy stuff with,
Yeah.
some feminist lesbian minister. It's like,
Yeah. I mean,
no,
that's what I've seen with like the Anglicans, especially. I've been getting kind of interested in like Anglican church history. I've been reading Cardinal Newman's book, who was
yeah,
a convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism. And like, for such a long time, the Anglicans like kind of prided themselves on being like very consistent, sort of like the middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. They were like, yeah, we have like sort of the good structure and sort of the consistent teachings without what they saw as like all the extra stuff of Catholicism, and we're not just sort of like the low church, do whatever you want kind of type Protestants. But now they're just, I mean, I think completely faltering on that. I mean, like
and,
complete endorsement of like the LGBT stuff. You have women priests and things like that, and so they're like very quickly going the same route as a lot of those other Protestant denominations as well.
yeah, they went mad, they went
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah,
But anyway, so let's go back to our subject, unless you had some other thoughts on
no,
that.
no,
He talks about immigration, how
no.
wonderful it is, which I
Yeah,
thought was interesting, but also that the immigrants had to become the people,
hmm,
and so, but he talks about how, like the children of, he talks about the values of the foreign workers and the foreign population immigrating into the country, but becoming part of the country. And
hmm,
then he mentions the children of foreign-born parents are real Americans. He
yeah,
asserts that on 183, and he seems to view that as a net good, and I'm sure it was at the time. And I guess it all depends on how you manage it, or so to speak. But he says, the immigration of so many millions from the old world has no doubt given the American people much of their bold, energetic, and adventurous character, made them a superior people on the whole to what they would otherwise have been. And I think that's one of the arguments that the pro-immigration uh, makes that it does resonate with me to a point, is that like the people that I interact with that are obviously Spanish speakers.
hmm,
I don't know what their immigration status is, but if I see them, working, or if they're at Quick Trip, like in the morning, if I stop off at Quick Trip on my way to work, it's like one of the Quick Trip's a gas station convenience store, and the one in Herculaneum is like one of the busiest ones in the whole region, maybe one of the busiest ones they have. And so there's a lot of work crews that come in the morning to get their drinks and snacks and stuff before they go out to job sites. Not just Hispanics, but there's a fair number of Spanish speakers, and
hmm,
they're talking Spanish. I don't know Spanish, but I know enough to know that it's Spanish, as opposed to something else. I know it's not English, of course, but there's a ton of them, and they're just hardworking people,
hmm,
and they're just trying to make a living for themselves and for their families. It's part of the description of, hey, we shouldn't try to kick all these people out because they're hardworking people. They, in theory, well, they're paying sales taxes for sure.
hmm,
They're not paying income taxes because it might be all cash business or whatever the case may be. But the problem is that when you just have it completely unfettered, then you're getting all the bad,
yeah,
getting all the bad, and you're getting some of the good.
yeah.
And I think that's the big problem that I have
Yeah.
with it. I think that's the big issue with it
Yeah.
politically.
It's also the case of, and he kind of mentions it here too, like they have to become part of the American people, right? It's
Correct.
not you come in and you remain sort of just like in an enclave of whatever society you came from. You have to come in and become part of the people. And one of the other arguments, like, against just, complete unfettered, let everybody in, whoever you want, aside from just the safety factor, is if you let so many people come in all at once, they're not going to assimilate as well. It'll be much easier for them to just sort of stay as their own distinct thing, and you won't have that unity, which of course does not work for either group, either the people who were already here and the people who are coming in, because it's just going to breed hostility between the two, and they won't be able to work well with one another. And so it's like you have to keep it at a manageable level, and incorporate them into the existing society.
Yeah, and that was some of the like, frankly, Catholic rhetoric of the earlier waves of Irish and some
Yeah,
German, certainly Italian immigrants because they were
yeah,
Catholic. But I think when it really changed was when they'd have flags and festivals and all that, and they'd have a dual American flag, Italian flag, because then
Mm,
they're Italian Americans. Or they'd have like a stream of flags sewn together, as a decoration and some, like Columbus Day, for example.
yeah.
And it'd be alternating, Italian American flags. And what offends me is if there's a rally or a protest or whatever, and it's a bunch of Mexican flags. And there's no American flags. It's
Uh,
like, well, just keep marching south, because that you should be welcome there.
yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right and that's what he kind of alludes to here, is that then they're part of the people of the nation. He makes that again that territorial argument about the sovereign nation, and but it's fascinating. He's discussing that in a different context, but he's talking about the French Huguenots and like they went to Holland and Germany and England and Ireland, and those immigrants really formed the backbone of a lot of the Judeo-Christian, really the Christian basis for their early colonialists. I mean, they
Yeah.
were religious colonies
Yeah.
and persecuted in their home countries, and they like offloaded them to the United States.
Hmm. Yeah, and then he goes on sort of in that same line of reasoning. He talks about, yeah, we probably shouldn't give suffrage rights to the freed slaves, at least not yet, for kind of that same reason of, well, they need to become part of society. But then he goes on and says, the great evil the country experiences is not from universal suffrage, but from what may be called rotation in office. The number
Yeah,
of political aspirants is so great that in the northern and western states especially, the representatives in Congress are changed every 2 or 4 years. And essentially, like as soon as you get enough experience necessary to qualify you for the position, you're booted out, right? And
yeah,
so it's like you just have so many people who are constantly vying for the same offices that you never really get anything done, and everybody's more concerned with whatever political appointment or higher position they can get. They're not really concerned about working for, the people, right? And
yeah,
I think that's that's still a very modern criticism that can be applied
sure.
today.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to fix or to get a solution to. In Missouri, years ago, there were no term limits, and then they instituted term limits, and the politicians hated it. But it was legislature's majority Democrat, and it immediately flipped majority Republican because all those incumbents that had that benefit of name recognition and were representing districts that they wouldn't be able to if they were unknown, got tossed out. And
Mm,
it's been a Republican legislature ever since, which in my view is better. But there's something to be said for being able to have build some expertise and knowledge base and to stay in office and to be able to guide the state or the country in through troubled times. But like in Missouri, there's 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate, and then there's two terms for the governor, limitation, and some other limitations for the state office holders. I think they're all limited to 2 terms. Like eight, 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 eight. So you could do 8 in the House, 8 in the Senate,
hmm
8, Attorney General, 8 in this and 8 in that.
Yeah.
Um, and I've noticed though that it causes them. First, they got to learn real fast. As soon as you're elected in the House, you got to really learn. Okay, how do I actually get the stuff
Yeah.
done? Where do I find the answers? And it accelerates all that because you don't think, well, I just have to run for reelection and I'll learn how to do it in 2 years or whatever. Because before you know it, you're out.
Yeah.
And it's a hard number. And so I think it accelerates the ability to get things done because people are working on it and they know, hey, I only got 8 years to get this
Hmm.
issue solved. But the people that don't want it know they can run out the clock and try to get different people in.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a lot of ladder climbing,
Yeah.
so if hey, I've only got 8 years, I got to do a couple terms. This one, I got to look at that state Senate race.
Yeah.
Like there's a state Senate race in our area, and there were 3 existing state reps. I think there were candidates and 1 former, or maybe 2 former. I mean, it
Wow.
was it was a loaded
Yeah.
primary.
Well, you saw that a lot when I was working in the Senate. Is there's kind of a reputation, like especially for the House members, of being like a little more crazy than the Senate members, like just on average, because it's like when you're looking at that position, you're elected for a 2-year term, and so it's like you really only have a little over a year before the next election cycle. And so it's like
Yeah.
what you see with the House, and there's 435 of them. And so
Yeah.
everybody's sort of vying to get their little like quick one-liner in on whatever the big issue is of the time. And so like everybody's kind of getting just a little bit more inflammatory than they would, in the Senate. Because it's like, okay, I need to get my TV spot in here. I need to get the line that people will quote about me to get my name out there a little bit more. And so it's like a little bit, it's not necessarily that they have more pressure to like get things done. They
Yeah.
just feel more pressure to like say something crazy to get on the news.
Right. Right. But I think on the whole, it'd be a good idea to have term limits
Yeah.
because, um, and I think on the whole it was a good idea in Missouri, and I think it's worked
Yeah.
out well because the fear was, well, then you have the permanent lobbyists and bureaucracy that's going to control the legislature because they won't know any better. But I found it's just the opposite. I mean,
Yeah.
the turnover it causes it causes them to actually have to do something, or maybe they can't get it done, which is just fine too. But there's just so much corruption. There's so much money.
Hmm.
Like a state Senate race. I mean, they're talking about this, and this is a job that's part-time legislature. I think it might pay 40 grand or something like that, less than 50. And I'm sure they spent total more than $1 million in this
Wow.
campaign for the state Senate race, when you add everybody up.
Yeah.
Huge, big money. And if you're just a regular citizen person, man or woman, that says, like you can sign up for a city council meeting locally, and if you are articulate and you contact enough of your neighbors, you got a good shot at being on the city council or being elected mayor. I mean, really good shot at it. Um, and maybe you have to spend a couple $100 on yard signs or something if you want to, or you could do it direct mail, but it's pretty rare. But if you're going to be any level of the state legislature, there's so many lobbyists and donors that want to kind of stack the deck on whatever their pet project is, especially like out of town, either anti-tax people or pro-abortion people are big donors in Missouri. I mean, it's hard for somebody to overcome that
Yeah.
because there's just so much negativity too. And then who wants
Mhm.
to go through that?
Yeah.
I ran for office. I don't want to do it again. Anyway,
Back
sorry
to the
about that.
book, yeah, the last couple pages here. He kind of gives a defense of having a standing military, which is interesting. 'Cause he's like, yeah, you need a
Yeah,
kind of a permanent class of people, because that's going to absorb the people, who just have that sort of military spirit, who would be kind of wasted in a
yeah.
lot of other settings. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's a good argument. I can see that.
Yeah, and that was
Uh,
controversial at the time because they didn't have a
yeah,
standing army. And historically, there's always been a controversy over having a standing army because then what stops a bad general from marching on Washington?
hmm
But we've survived it so
yeah.
far.
And he also says, wars are inevitable. Things are going to happen as we move forward in the country here. Like we'll need a standing army at some point. And he even says like if we had a standing army, maybe the whole Civil War would have been stopped before it started because then
Mhm.
Lincoln could have just sent the troops down and quashed the rebellion. When it was still just a rebellion of a few people, wasn't the full states themselves trying to secede and build up their own armies and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Of course, now the counter argument, the more modern one is, if we didn't have this, they call it military industrial complex, would we have invaded Iraq?
Yeah, exactly.
Why not? Maybe Afghanistan because the people that trained to hit or the Twin Towers in 9/11. Well, and I'm about to say, if you believe what they say about them, yeah, I've completely lost any trust of any governmental report. I don't know what's happened to me in the last
Yeah.
year. I'm even doing like Trump hand signs. But anyway, so I mean, there's a legitimate criticism of having this built-in power structure, and I think some of the things that like Tulsi Gabbard and and JD Vance was just on with Jake Tapper. Jake Tapper's like yelling at him. But his point was, hey, there's a fair number of these Trump critics that worked in his office that thought they can control him, and he's anti-war,
Yeah.
and they don't want that. And it just seems weird that people would want war. But I think there are people that think that American military involvement, which of course necessarily means us killing people,
Hmm.
is good for America and good for the world.
Yeah.
And I think there's some truth to that. That's why they're critical of him.
For sure.
But the author doesn't foresee that.
Yeah. I
So
mean, how could you? How could you expect it to go so big? Like he foresees a lot of things, the more sort of social things,
right.
that he can kind of see the path going there. But like, would he have imagined in 150 years that American troops would be consistently in the Middle East? Right? I
Right.
just don't see
Yeah.
like I don't see any way
Oh,
you could have predicted that. Like, yeah, it's
yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. I mean, they of course famously went after the Barbary pirates.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Jefferson did that,
Yeah,
but yeah,
that's true.
I think we were invading countries over there.
Yeah. But then that kind of brings us to the end of the chapter here, where he's talking, and I think again he summarizes things very well. He says, of the several tendencies mentioned, the humanitarian tendency, egoistical at the south, detaching the individual from the race, and socialistic at the north, absorbing the individual in the race, is the most dangerous. The egoistical form is checked sufficiently, weakened by the defeat of the rebels, but the social form believes that it has triumphed and that individuals are effaced in society and the states in the union. He's essentially saying, like, we have to be vigorous about this. We have to make sure that this doesn't progress any further. And of course, 150 years later, we did exactly that, and things have gotten further. And I think that that's sort of what he describes as the northern tendency is absolutely won in just about all cases. And you see, like, sort of libertarians kind of trying to pull up the old idea of what the South had, but they have really no political power here and are just absolutely dwarfed by that more socialistic tendency.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Good
Well, do you
summary.
have any other final thoughts on this chapter?
No, but I think at some point in next week's show, we should make our predictions about the election.
No, that's true. Yeah, because that'll come out. Well, that'll come out election day. These go up on Tuesday mornings now. So maybe somebody on the way to the polls will be listening to this for our insightful commentary on that.
I'm anticipating. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts,
Mm,
predictions. I might revise my previous prediction, which is based on the most absurd and funny result, which I will share now, which is Trump will barely win the electoral college, and the difference will be that he wins Minnesota, Tim Walz's home state. Uh, but I don't know that I'll have to. Well, it's another week. Who
yeah,
knows what's
we'll
happening?
see. Yeah,
I,
maybe
I,
there'll be another assassination attempt.
well, I was just about to say, I hope all four of them, the major candidates, president, vice president, are healthy and nothing bad happens to them physically, and that that everybody acts reasonably responsible, and whether they win or lose, and hopefully they'll remember they're patriots, and we'll all get through this.
Yeah, hopefully.
I am feeling more hopeful, aren't I?
That's good. That was a very hopeful note. Usually you would end on this country's gonna burn down or something like that. That's usually what you would end on.
Yes. So maybe next week I'll be in the or maybe we need to burn it all down.
Yeah, there we go.
We need to
Um,
do it.
we do need to think about our next book too. So if anyone has any recommendations, they can tweet at us at ULMTD opinions on Twitter. But you're the one picking this time, so you can take the audience's many suggestions that I'm sure we'll receive with a grain of salt, and you can pick what you
Flooded
want.
with them. I'm thinking maybe a Thomas Sowell.
Okay.
He has some surveys or writings. Something that it might be we might be able to jump off on. Not like it
Mhm.
because he has some single topic or
Yeah.
relatively single topic books, but maybe something along those lines might be interesting. I think he's one of the most brilliant um, political philosophers or social scientists or whatever you categorize him. I think in our nation's history. I
Yeah.
mean, some of the stuff he's written, and he's so articulate. He's such a friendly person. If you ever listen to his interviews, he's got this deep laugh. He does
Mhm.
remind me a little bit of like Clarence Thomas.
Mhm.
Just the good nature, and they were both of the left.
Yeah.
They were both leftists, almost like revolutionary types in their
Mhm.
youth. And then they, they read books and stats and like, wait, this doesn't work, which is very powerful.
Well, there you go. Maybe we'll have a Thomas Sowell book for next season, for season 10, if you can believe that.
I can't believe it. That's assuming you still want to do it. You still
Yeah,
want to do
yeah, no, of course, of course. And the many hundreds of thousands of people who listen every week want us to keep doing it too.
it. Well, that's true. That's true. I will make this prediction.
Okay.
This is a long-term prediction. Uh, the election, I think in the next 4 years, Trump will convert to Catholicism.
He did, post the St. Michael's prayer and the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. That's pretty wild.
He's been playing the Ave Maria
Yeah.
at rallies. He did it. The first I heard was in the when he went back to when he got shot,
Hmm.
and that was more of a memorial for Mr. Campatori, I think.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Comparatory. Yeah.
And I think I assume he was Catholic because they had a lot of themes about that. But he's played it since then,
Yeah.
Vance, and I think that shooting did make a difference to him. I
Hmm.
do. He's a little different
Yeah.
than he was pre-shooting.
Hmm.
Well, I think I think I'm a little worried about it too, because I think he thinks that he's convinced it was divine intervention, and and I respect that, but you want to make sure that you're still listening to that intervention and you don't
Yeah.
presume to know why the intervention occurred. Maybe it's to you know save you, or maybe it's to warn you,
Hmm.
or maybe it's to help you be more faithful or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens for sure.
Yes.
All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts? Two
No.
more final thoughts out of the way at this point. All right. Well, this has been. Do you have another final thought? It looked like you were about to say something.
I'm done.
All right. Well, this has been season 9, episode 14 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.